The landline rang at 2:19 inches the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been sitting in the kitchen, same as most nights, staring at the bottom of a coffee mug I'd already emptied twice. Sleep and I had a complicated relationship since my son disappeared. My doctor called it complicated grief. I called it 3 years of lying awake, wondering where I went wrong. The landline almost never rang anymore. Most people my age had given up on them, and the only calls I got were insurance scammers and the occasional wrong number. I'd kept the line because Daniel used to call me on it every Sunday afternoon. Said landlines felt more solid somehow, more permanent. Said cell phones were for emergencies and landlines were for conversations. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me cross the kitchen in my bare feet and pick it up, and when I saw the caller ID display, I stopped breathing. It showed Daniel's cell number. The number that had been disconnected 3 years ago, the month after my son walked out of his life and never came back. "Hello," I said, and my voice sounded like someone else's entirely. Silence. Then breathing, quick and shallow, the breathing of someone who'd been running. "Is this Harold Mercer?" A girl's voice, young, scared. "Yes," I said. "Who is this? How are you calling from this number? Please." She was whispering now. "Please, I need help. I'm outside your house. I've been standing here for 20 minutes trying to work up the nerve to knock. I know this is strange. I know you don't know me, but I didn't have anywhere else to go, and I found your address in my mother's things, and I think you might be my grandfather." I stood there in the kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and I felt something crack open in my chest that I hadn't even realized was sealed. "I'll be right there," I said. She was standing at the edge of the porch light, half in shadow, like she wasn't sure she deserved to step all the way into it. Early 20s, dark hair soaked flat against her skull from the rain that had been falling all evening. She was wearing a canvas jacket, 2 sizes too big for her, carrying a backpack with one strap, and she was shivering so hard her teeth were clicking together like a metronome. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. Daniel's eyes. The exact same shade, that particular gray-green that I'd always thought was unique to my son, something I'd never seen on another person in my 67 years on this earth. And around those eyes, the same set to her jaw, the same slight downward pull at the corners of her mouth when she was holding something in. "Come inside," I said, before she could speak another word. I put her at the kitchen table and made her tea she didn't ask for, and sat across from her the way I'd sat across from Daniel 100 times when he was young and had something difficult to say. And I waited. Her name was Sophie. Sophie Callahan, from Memphis originally, though she'd been moving around for the past several months and didn't have a fixed address anymore. Her mother was a woman named Laura Callahan, who had died 14 months ago of liver failure. Before she died, Laura had told Sophie the truth about her father, that the man listed on Sophie's birth certificate was not her biological father, that her real father was a man named Daniel Mercer, whom Laura had known for 1 semester of college in 2000, before a pregnancy she hadn't told him about and a life that had taken her in a different direction entirely. Laura had kept a box under her bed. Letters Daniel had written that semester, 2 photographs, a slip of paper with his parents' address in Knoxville, Tennessee, and a note in Laura's handwriting that said, "If something ever happens to me, find Harold Mercer. Tell him who you are. He deserves to know." "I didn't know your mother," I said carefully. "I know." Sophie wrapped both hands around the mug. She knew that. She said she never told him about me because by the time she realized she was pregnant, things had ended badly between them. She said he was a good person, that she didn't want to complicate his life. She thought about reaching out after I was born, but she heard he'd gotten serious with someone else, and she let it go. She always said she'd find the right moment, and then she got sick, and the right moment never came. I thought about Daniel at 20, the summer before his junior year, full of that restless energy he always had, constantly moving towards something he couldn't quite name. I thought about how many things people carry in silence, how many whole lives exist in the space between what we tell each other and what we don't. "You said someone's looking for you," I said, because I'd seen the way her eyes went to the window every few minutes. The way she startled at the sound of a car passing on the road outside. Sophie set down the mug. "When my mom died, I wanted to find out more about Daniel. She said his name quietly, like it was still unfamiliar in her mouth. I reached out to some people, found some old connections. That's when I found her. His wife. I kept my face still. Claire, I said. Sophie nodded. I called her, told her who I was, and she seemed fine at first. Surprised, but fine. She invited me to come visit. Said she had some of Daniel's things she'd been meaning to sort through, and maybe I'd want some of them. I drove up to Nashville in September. She paused, pressed her lips together. Something felt wrong from the start. She kept asking questions about what my mother had told me, whether she'd kept any letters or documents, whether my mother had ever mentioned anything about Daniel's business. And her brother was there, the whole time. Ray. He never left the room. Every time I tried to have a conversation with just Claire, he'd appear in the doorway. At dinner, he sat right across from me and watched me the way you watch something you're figuring out what to do with. I knew Ray Hartley, Claire's younger brother, the kind of man who smiled with his mouth while his eyes stayed busy. He'd been around throughout Daniel and Claire's marriage, always positioned at the edge of things. Helping out, Claire always said. Just helpful Ray. I'd never trusted him. I'd never said so to Daniel because Daniel loved Claire and what kind of father makes his son choose, but I'd never trusted him. That second night, Sophie continued, I woke up because I heard them in the kitchen. It was late, maybe 2 inches the morning. I could hear them through the vent. Ray was saying they needed to deal with this before it went any further. And Claire said, You mean like we dealt with Daniel? And Ray said, Exactly like that. And then Claire said, If her mother told her what I think she told her, we don't have a choice. The kitchen was very quiet. I realized I'd stopped breathing again. I climbed out the window, Sophie said. I didn't even take all my things. I just grabbed my backpack and my mom's box and I ran. I've been couch surfing, staying off cash, turning off my phone for days at a time. But last week, I saw Ray's car outside the coffee shop where I was working. He was sitting in it, watching the door. I quit that day and I've been driving since. I found your address in my mother's papers 3 months ago. And I almost came then. And I kept telling myself it was too strange, too much to ask. But I don't have anywhere else. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to show up like this. Don't apologize, I said. And my voice came out steady, which surprised me, because nothing inside me was steady in the least. Daniel had not walked away from his life. I had spent 3 years telling myself the story Claire had given me, because the alternative was something I couldn't hold without breaking. Daniel had been under enormous pressure, Claire told me, in those first awful weeks. The business had struggled during COVID. They'd been fighting, he'd been depressed and not sleeping, and one day he'd packed a bag and driven away, and his car had been found at a rest stop outside Chattanooga, and he was simply gone. Walked away. Started over somewhere. Didn't want to be found. I had never entirely believed it. But I had let myself believe it because believing the other thing required me to do something. And I was an old man who had just lost his son, and I was so tired. I stood up from the table. Come with me, I said. Daniel had kept an office in this house before he moved to Nashville, back when he was first starting his contracting business. A spare bedroom he'd converted, bookshelves built floor to ceiling, a desk he'd salvaged from an estate sale and refinished himself. After he disappeared, I hadn't touched it. Claire had come once to go through his things in Nashville, efficient and tearful and gracious, and I'd let her handle all of it because I could barely get dressed in the mornings. But this room I'd kept, partly grief, partly something I couldn't name until right now, standing in the doorway with Sophie behind me, looking at my son's handwriting on the spines of the notebooks, lined up between his reference books. Daniel had kept journals since he was 19. Not a diary exactly, more like a running record of his thinking. He'd been analytical that way, needed to put things on paper to understand them. Claire had told me she'd gone through his home office in Nashville and hadn't found any current notebooks. I'd assumed he'd stopped keeping them, but these were here. The older ones, from before he moved to Nashville. And if I knew my son, if I knew him the way I believed I did, the habit doesn't stop. It just finds a new location. I started at the most recent dates. Sophie watched from the doorway, not speaking, giving me space I didn't know I needed. The last notebook in the sequence ended in the fall, before he disappeared. The entries got shorter toward the end, clipped, like he was writing under pressure. Then I found a smaller notebook tucked behind the others, its spine unmarked. I almost missed it. The first entry was dated 8 months before Daniel vanished. "I can't write this down anywhere she might find it," it began. "So I'm sending this home." I sat down on the floor of my son's old office and I read. The business had done well after COVID. Better than well. Daniel had grown his contracting company into a mid-sized operation, and he'd taken on a partner, a developer named Paul Whitfield, who brought in commercial projects that Daniel's residential focus couldn't have accessed alone. The partnership had been Claire's idea. She'd met Whitfield through Ray, who did something vague in commercial real estate. Daniel had had reservations, but Claire was persuasive and the money was real and he'd signed. What he discovered, 8 months before he disappeared, was that Paul Whitfield had been running a systematic fraud through their shared business. Falsified structural inspections on 3 commercial properties. Reports signed off by a building inspector named Gerald Foss, who had been on Whitfield's payroll for years. The money saved on legitimate inspections, on proper materials, on code compliance, had been funneled back through a series of shell accounts that Ray Hartley managed. Daniel had found out because one of the buildings failed. A warehouse in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, built on a foundation that looked correct on paper and was not. A section of the floor had collapsed during a delivery in March. 2 workers had fallen. One had broken both legs and his pelvis. The other had been 24 years old, a father of a 7-month-old daughter. He had not survived. Daniel had gone to the site. He'd pulled the permits, the inspection records, the materials manifests. He'd started seeing the pattern. He'd started documenting everything. March 18th, he wrote, "I found the shell accounts. Ray is in this up to his neck, and Claire knows. She has to know. Ray doesn't do anything without telling Claire. I keep waiting for her to say something, to explain it, to give me a reason why I'm wrong about what I'm seeing. She hasn't." April 4th. I made copies of everything. The inspection reports with Foss's signature, the bank transfers, the emails between Whitfield and Ray, where they're basically writing down the whole scheme in plain language like they're untouchable. I hid everything. I need to figure out the right way to go to the authorities, the right person to contact, someone who isn't already in Whitfield's pocket. There's a young man's family in Murfreesboro who lost everything, and nobody has been held responsible, and I cannot live with that. May 12th. Claire knows I've found something. She hasn't asked directly. She's being careful, the way she gets careful when she's working something out. Ray came by twice this week. The second time, I wasn't home, and Claire didn't mention it. If she told him I was home when I wasn't, that's a problem. The last entry was dated 8 days before Daniel's car was found at that rest stop. May 29th. I confronted Claire last night. I had to. I told her what I know, showed her some of what I have. She cried, which I wasn't expecting. She said Whitfield had threatened Ray, said Ray had gotten in over his head, and she'd been trying to protect her brother. She said the man who died. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. It was an accident. The building wasn't supposed to be used for heavy deliveries. Like that matters. Like that makes the 7-month-old girl less fatherless. I told her I was going to the state attorney's office. I told her she could come with me, or she could take her chances separately. But I was going. She stopped crying very quickly when I said that. Ray is going to be a problem. I know that. I've made copies of everything and put them somewhere safe. If something happens to me, the copies are at the warehouse on Linden Street, the one I renovated in 2019. Dad's first job. He knows the building. 3rd floor storage room, behind the false panel I built on the east wall. He helped me build it. He'll know what to look for. Dad, if you're reading this, I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you any of this in person. I was afraid of what it might put you in the middle of. But if you're reading this, I think I already put you in the middle of it anyway. Do what you know is right. You always taught me to. I was just trying to follow your example. Sophie was sitting on the floor next to me. I didn't know when she'd moved from the doorway. I wasn't crying. I was past the part of grief that cries. I was somewhere beyond that, somewhere colder and more purposeful. Somewhere I recognized from the years when I was young enough to believe that anger could be made useful if you pointed it in the right direction. The warehouse on Linden Street, I said. I know it. I built the panel, I said. Me and Daniel, the summer of 2019. He wanted a secure storage space in the renovation, somewhere to keep tools and materials that wouldn't be obvious from a walkthrough. I framed it myself. Nobody else knew it was there. "We need to go," Sophie said. We left before dawn. The warehouse was 40 minutes from my house. A 3-story brick building in a neighborhood that had been industrial and was slowly becoming something else. Coffee shops and studios pressing up against loading docks and machine shops. I had the key. Daniel had given me a copy when the renovation was finished. The way he always gave me copies of things. Said it was practical. Said, "You never know." I had thought it was just Daniel being Daniel. Prepared, thorough. Now I understood he'd been leaving me breadcrumbs for exactly this moment. The 3rd floor was dusty and quiet, stacked with old lumber and the kind of things that accumulate in a working building. The east wall looked unbroken to anyone who didn't know better. I found the seam by touch, the same way I'd run the trim when I built it, running my thumb along the baseboard until I felt the slight give that meant the hidden latch was behind the panel. It opened. Inside, in a waterproof zipper bag, was a manila envelope. I opened it with Sophie standing next to me in the gray early light coming through the high windows. Inspection reports with Gerald Foss's notarized signature, alongside photographs of the actual foundation work that bore no resemblance to what the reports described. Bank statements showing transfers between Whitfield's company and 3 LLCs registered to Ray Hartley. Email chains between Whitfield and Ray, explicit enough that even a first-year prosecutor could understand what they were reading. And a handwritten timeline in Daniel's neat, small printing connecting every piece, dated and sourced. "There's enough here," Sophie said quietly. "There's enough and more," I said. But there was one thing missing. This proved the fraud, the inspection falsification, the financial crime that had led to a young man's death. What it didn't prove was what happened to Daniel. What it didn't prove was the thing Claire had said to Ray in a Nashville kitchen at 2 a.m. while my granddaughter listened through a heating vent. "We need to make them say it," Sophie said, and she looked at me steadily, and I saw Daniel in her face so clearly it almost knocked me flat. "We need to make them say it," I agreed. I called a lawyer first, not a criminal defense attorney, but a man named Vince Collier I'd known for 30 years, who had done the legal work when I started my business, and who I trusted the way you trust someone who has been honest with you when honesty was inconvenient. I told him everything. I gave him the copies of Daniel's documents, and I told him to hold them. And I told him that if I hadn't called him within 12 hours, he should go to the FBI field office in Knoxville and give them everything. He started to ask questions. I told him I didn't have time for questions. Then I called Claire, Harold. Her voice was warm and practiced. She had always been good at warm and practiced. "It's so good to hear from you. How are you doing?" "I need to see you," I said. "I've found something of Daniel's, something he left behind here at the house. I think you should come." Silence, brief and controlled. "What did you find?" "I'd rather show you in person," I said, "and bring Ray. What I found concerns both of you." "Harold, why would Ray need to be there?" "Because I think he'll want to hear this," I said. "I'll explain everything when you arrive." Longer silence this time. "We can be there this evening," she said. "Around 7? "I'll have coffee on," I said. I spent that day making preparations. Sophie and I set up her phone on the bookshelf in the living room, tucked between 2 volumes, angled to capture the seating area. We tested the angle and the audio 3 times. We made sure it was backing up continuously to a cloud account in Sophie's name. We ran through the conversation we wanted to have, and the conversation we feared we'd have instead. And we built ourselves an exit route through the back of the house, just in case. Just in case being the operative phrase. Because I was 67 years old with a bad knee and a granddaughter I'd known for less than 24 hours, and we were about to sit across from 2 people who had, if Daniel's journal was right, arranged for my son to be killed and made it look like he'd abandoned his life. I was not unafraid, but I had been afraid every day for 3 years. The background radiation, kind of afraid that you get so used to, you stop recognizing it as fear. This was different. This was afraid with a direction to it. 7 o'clock came and went. They arrived at 7:20, Claire in a gray coat and good boots, Ray behind her in dark jeans and a jacket. He had the same scanning quality I'd always noticed, eyes moving over the room before he'd fully stepped into it. Assessing, locating. "Harold," Claire said, and embraced me. And I let her. We sat in the living room. Claire on the couch, Ray standing near the hallway door with his arms loosely folded, positioned between us and the exit the way someone positions themselves when they're thinking about exits. "You said you found something," Claire said. "I found my granddaughter," I said. The color left Claire's face in a wave. Ray's arms unfolded. Sophie stepped out of the kitchen doorway. She had Daniel's eyes and Daniel's jaw, and she stood there in the living room of my house and looked at Claire the way you look at something you're not going to look away from. And Claire stared back at her, and something moved across Claire's face that I hadn't expected to see there. Guilt. Real, unperformed guilt. The kind that doesn't care who's watching. "Sophie," Claire said. Her voice was barely audible. "You know her name," I said. "Daniel told me about Laura once," Claire said. "A long time ago, before we were married. He found out she'd had a baby. He thought it might be his. He tried to reach her, and she didn't respond. He always wondered. He would have wanted to know her. Then why are you hunting her?" I asked. Claire closed her eyes. Ray said, "We should go." "Sit down, Ray," I said. He looked at me with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite surprise. The expression of a man who has stopped taking old men seriously and has not yet been given a reason to reconsider that policy. "I think we need to go, Harold," Claire said. "I don't know what Sophie told you, but she's been under enormous stress, and I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Claire," I said, "I found the warehouse on Linden Street." She went very still. "I found the envelope," I said. "I found everything Daniel hid, the inspection reports, the bank transfers, Gerald Foss's signature on work that was never done. And I read my son's journals. Everything he wrote in the months before you had him killed." "Don't," Claire said sharply. "I heard you," Ray said. His voice was flat now, the warmth entirely gone, and he was looking at me the way he'd been looking at Sophie, and I understood that we had moved into a different kind of conversation. "We're not doing this here. Get up, both of you." "Sophie," I said quietly. She reached behind the bookshelf and held up her phone where they could see it. Ray moved toward her. I was on my feet faster than my knee wanted me to be, and I was between them. And I am 67 years old, and I spent 30 of those years doing physical labor. And whatever Ray had expected from me, it wasn't that. He pulled up short, recalculating. "That's recording live to the cloud right now," I said. "There are already copies of Daniel's documents with my attorney. If you walk out that door, the next call he makes is to the FBI. You will not get ahead of this. Your only option right now is to tell the truth." Ray looked at Claire. "The thing about guilt is that it compresses. You spend years sitting on it, and it gets smaller and smaller, and you start to believe it might disappear entirely. And then something puts pressure on it from the outside, and it detonates all at once." Claire put her face in her hands. Ray said, his voice brittle now, stripped of everything. "Thomas wouldn't let it go. We tried. Claire tried for months. Told him we could find another way. That Whitfield would handle the compensation quietly. That nobody needed to know the details about the foundation. Daniel said there was a family in Murfreesboro who deserved justice." He paused. Some kind of struggle happening behind his eyes. I told him he needed to think it over. Really think it over. That some things couldn't be untaken once they were in motion. I drove out to where he was staying at the time, this rental outside Chattanooga where he'd been trying to clear his head. We argued. Things got physical. It wasn't supposed to go like it did. But it did. And then I had to figure out what came next. What came next was a car at a rest stop and an empty life, and 3 years of me counting days and lying awake and letting Claire put her hand on my shoulder at a memorial service while she already knew. She already knew. She knew before the memorial service, I said. Claire's hands came down from her face. Her eyes were red and dry, past the point of tears. "I told myself Daniel would have understood," she said. "Eventually, I told myself we could have made it right without destroying everything, without destroying Ray. I kept telling myself, There's a family in Murfreesboro, I said. There is a young woman raising a daughter without her father, because your family decided that was acceptable. Don't tell me what you told yourself. The sirens started 4 minutes later. I had called Vince before Claire and Ray arrived and told him to call the Knox County Sheriff's Department and tell them he had reason to believe there was an ongoing threat to persons at my address. I had asked him to send them at 8:15. It was 8:12 when Ray started talking. Officers came through the front door with their hands visible and their voices calm and professional, and Ray did not run because there was nowhere to run to. And Claire sat on my couch and did not move at all, and Sophie stood in the corner of the living room with her phone still raised, still recording, and watched it happen. There is nothing clean about what comes after. The investigation took 11 months. The state attorney's office took the lead initially, and then the FBI became involved when the shell companies traced back across state lines. Gerald Foss agreed to cooperate within 2 weeks of being contacted. Paul Whitfield hired 6 lawyers, and it didn't matter. Ray's statement was on record, on video, backed up to 4 cloud accounts, and in the possession of my attorney before any lawyer could advise him to stop speaking. Ray Hartley was charged with second-degree murder and multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. He was convicted on all counts. 22 years, no parole possibility for the first 15. Claire was charged as an accessory after the fact, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. She had known. She had helped arrange what happened after. The memorial service, the management of my grief, the quiet, efficient handling of everything that might have led anyone to look too closely. 18 years. She'll be 60 before she sees the outside of a building without a guard on the door. Paul Whitfield got 12 years. Gerald Foss got 4 with time served. The family in Murfreesboro, a woman named Deb Okafor and her daughter, now 4 years old, filed a civil suit that settled for an amount I'm not supposed to discuss. The settlement doesn't bring her husband back. It doesn't give her daughter a father at a school play or a first baseball game or any of the 1,000 ordinary moments that got stolen. But Deb Okafor stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing, and she said that she had wondered every day for 3 years whether anyone was going to be held responsible, whether her husband's death was just going to be absorbed into the indifference of things. She said it wasn't. I watched that on the evening news in my living room with Sophie sitting in the chair that used to be Daniel's chair. And neither of us said anything for a long time. She lives here now. In the spare room we repainted in October, the walls a soft sage green she picked out herself. She deferred her enrollment at the University of Memphis, where she'd been 2 semesters in before her mother got sick, and she re-enrolled for the spring semester. She's studying architecture. She says she wants to understand how buildings work, what makes them hold, and what makes them fail. I asked her once if that was about her father, and she said, not entirely. She said it was about understanding the difference between things that look solid and things that actually are. She found a photograph of Daniel in a box in the office, taken when he was about her age, standing in front of a house he'd helped frame, young and proud and squinting in the afternoon sun. She put it on her desk. Some evenings we drive out to the warehouse on Linden Street, which has a new owner now who has been slowly converting it into studio spaces. We don't go inside anymore. We just drive past it. I think Sophie needs to see that it's still standing, that the building didn't disappear just because what was hidden inside it was brought into the light. I tell her stories about Daniel, not the last year, not the journals, not the decisions that led to a rest stop outside Chattanooga. The real stories, the ones that make him a person instead of a mystery. The time he was 12 and decided to build a treehouse entirely by himself and made it 6 feet before asking me for help. And by then the whole structure was tilted about 15 degrees to the left, and somehow he'd nailed the ladder. On the outside, the way he used to call me every Sunday and talk for an hour about nothing in particular, the weather and some article he'd read and what he was planning to cook for dinner. The look on his face the first time a building he'd worked on from foundation to trim was finished, and he could stand inside it and know that it would hold. He was a person who believed that things should be what they said they were. That's the hardest lesson and the most necessary one, and he knew it before I fully did. What I've learned from all of this, the 3 years of not knowing, and the single night of finally knowing and everything that came after, is not simple. But if I had to put it plainly, I would say this. Pay attention to the things that don't add up. Not every inconsistency is a crime, but when the people closest to you are working hard to make sure you don't ask questions, that is not peace they're offering you. That is management. Grief makes you a target if you let it. Not for cruel people specifically, though sometimes for those too, but for your own willingness to accept a story that lets you rest. I accepted a story about my son for 3 years because the truth required me to act, and acting required me to believe I had enough left in me to fight. I want to tell you that you do. Whatever age you are, and whatever you have left, you do. And the last thing, there was a young woman in Memphis raising a child alone, not knowing whether anyone would ever hold responsible the people who made her a widow at 26. There are people living with the weight of wrongs that never got righted, waiting without knowing they're waiting, hoping without letting themselves call it hope. It matters that you fight, not because victory is guaranteed, not because the right outcome always comes, but because the alternative is letting people who did something wrong get comfortable with having done it. And I have watched that happen, and I will tell you, it is a kind of damage that does not heal. The rain has stopped. Sophie's upstairs, studying. I can hear her moving around. The coffee on the stove is ready, and I'll take her a cup in a few minutes, the way I used to take Daniel a cup when he was up late working at that salvage desk. And she'll look up and say thanks the same way he did, with that half-distracted focus of someone who hasn't fully come back from wherever their mind was. I spent 3 years believing my son chose to leave. I know the truth now, and the truth is harder than the lie was. The truth has weight and edges and costs something every single morning, but it is solid in a way the lie never was. And I am 67 years old, and I am building something new on top of it, and I think it's going to hold.